Good morning and welcome to the Housing Opportunities Commission Development and Finance Committee meeting of December 1st, 2023. I'm Jeff Merkowitz. To my left is Commissioner Rick Nelson, and to my right is Commissioner Robin Solomon. Our first order of business today is the approval of the minutes from the meeting of October 27th, 2023. Is there a motion to approve? Motion has been moved and properly seconded. All in favor, say aye. Aye. The motion is approved. Our next item and first item of official business, or I guess that was official business technically, is a discussion on the Westwood emergency procurement for a final fire panel replacement. I will turn it over to President Chelsea Andrews.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, committee members, members of the public, and the HLC team. This matter comes before the committee in a request for support in moving forward with replacing the fire panel at Westwood Towers. We will hear additional details related to this request from our Vice President of Asset Management. But before I turn it over to him, I do want to provide some context in regards to the reference of this being an emergency procurement. Obviously, the need for us to move quickly in this particular matter is imperative because it's a health and safety issue. And as a result, instead of deploying the full RFP process, staff was able to quickly obtain quotes and move forward with a limited notice to proceed with the authority that I have under $250,000. This request comes to the board for the remainder of the costs, as well as just, of course, to educate the board in terms of where we are related to this property, and our overall capital needs obviously are something that we wanted to address holistically. And so I will turn it over to John Wilhoit, our Vice President of Asset Management, to provide more details.
Thank you, Madam President. Good morning, Commissioners. My name is John Wilhoit, Vice President, Asset Management. I'm here to present to you on Westwood Tower our emergency fire panel approval request. It is a health and safety matter. It's a 212-unit building, which is substantially occupied. The purpose of this request is for Westwood Tower that requires emergency replacement of building's fire panel and associated system structures. The cost is $470,570. The building was built in 1968, and this is original equipment from that build. This property is in Bethesda. It's 15 stories, multifamily, with 212 units, and the occupancy is 96%. The background is the fire panel for this property has reached the end of its useful life. It's currently inoperable and cannot be repaired. The fire marshal has determined that the building cannot continue to be operated without full repair of the system, and that fire watch is a must and must be placed immediately, and we have done so. The cost of the fire watch is approximately $6,000 per week. Next slide, please. Oh, first slide and second slide. Yes, we're there. Thank you. The fire panel is the brain and the central processing unit of the fire system. Due to the age of the system and recent problems with the voice system, replacing all obsolete equipment with the latest model and technology available is required. This includes all fire panel components, voice controls, amplifiers, XPP boards located in remote transponders. There is a reference on this slide to the approximate amount of time it will take. We do hope to condense this to the best of our ability. Next slide, please. Issues for your consideration. Does the Development and Finance Committee support the recommendation of staff for the Commission to approve to enact the emergency procedures of Section 5.6 of the procurement policy to replace the fire panel at Westwood Tower, and authorize the President Executive Director to negotiate and execute a contract with Summit Fire and Security to complete the full scope replacement of the fire panel at Westwood Tower at a cost of $470,570. The budget impact is as follows. The fire panel is an essential component to life safety operations at Westwood Tower. To that end, impact to the Westwood Tower capital budget is significant, with this dollar amount being $470,000. That's an increase of $420,000 over what our projected expenses were for this one item in the current fiscal year. We do have in our reserve account presently just under $700,000, and we add $250,000 annually to the CapEx reserve account for this asset. The impact of the operating budget to the operating budget is an increase of approximately $160,000 for Firewatch if it took this long, 6 months, to implement the new system. To offset the impact of HOC's operating budget, the contribution to the debt service account can be reduced to cover this unexpected expense, and the debt service account is well funded. Staff recommendation and commission action needed. Staff recommends that the Development and Finance Committee support its recommendation to the Commission to approve the enactment of the emergency procedures of Section 5.6 of the procurement policy to replace the fire panel at Westwood Tower, and authorize the President, Executive Director to negotiate and execute a contract with Summit Fire and Security to complete the full scope replacement of the fire panel at Westwood Tower at a cost of $470,570. Thank you for your attention to this matter.
Thanks. This is obviously something we have to do. The main question I have, anytime we get an emergency request like this is, why is it coming to us now, or why is it that this isn't something that, we presumably knew would have to be done, but now we're waiting until we have to have this fire watch and the additional expense.
I couldn't really find a paper trail, but I can tell you the story that I have thus far, and that is this unit was looked at extensively in approximately 2022, and the original bid was $300,000, but I can't find the bids for that. But what came after the bid was a change order for an additional $150,000. So at that point, the work did not proceed, and repairs were further made at that time. So repairs have continued to be made, but at this point, the fire marshal is saying there's too many false alarms, and we really need to proceed with full replacement.
Yeah, it's just, and I think obviously precedes both of your times, but Kareem will remember this, that there was, a couple of years back, we got a number of emergency procurement requests for roof replacements. And, again, it was the same sort of issue of these are things that we should see coming, and not wait until the expense is magnified by having to do it on an emergency basis. My only other question is if you could go back to the timeline there on the slides.
Slide 3.
Yeah. When the 8 weeks of submittals, has that already, we seem to, what are the submittals? Are those the proposals? We're voting on a proposal here.
No, the proposals we have in hand. The submittals are generation of plans, submission for approvals, and we hope to condense that timeline.
Got it. Okay. Are there other questions?
I had basically the same questions you had. I'm confused though, back on the prior slide, where you say that in the last paragraph, the selected vendor, once awarded, presented change orders and increased the price by 150. The work didn't proceed. That means we actually awarded a contract?
That's the documentation I haven't been able to find. When you're speaking historically in 2022?
I think that, let me jump in here, and maybe that needs to be reworded. The vendor was not awarded. However, a vendor was identified, and our understanding is that there are only a handful of vendors that do this work. So a vendor was identified, presented an initial quote, came back with another 150,000. And at that time, there was a pause. You all probably also know with this property that the thought was that there would be a comprehensive capital plan because that review and process was underway, but was stalled as a result of the legal proceedings. But this is definitely a situation in which, at this juncture, I think the thought was continue repairs. Let's see what happens with our legal proceedings, determine if we want to do a full refinance, whatever we want to do for the property so that we can make all of the other repairs that are needed comprehensively at the same time. And time just hasn't been on our side here. And so we're at a point where we do need to proceed. But yes, we will modify that verbiage, especially as this moves forward to the commission, because it's not that the board awarded any contract. It's just that the staff at the time had identified a contractor and was looking forward to presenting something to the board, but ultimately they came back with a much higher change order.
But I hear that. I'm not sure why the wording is the way it is, but if we had gone that far, then we knew that we had a serious problem. All these questions about financing of Westwood Towers shouldn't have affected our need to go forward with a life safety issue. I'm confused. If we had reached the point of identifying a vendor, then we knew that we had a serious issue that needed to be addressed. And we had an extra 150 that was required according to the vendor. And then we just dropped it. We didn't even include it in the budget, which we knew was going to have to be done. I just don't understand.
Well, I can answer that. We did not, and as you now can see, have an ongoing asset management division that was closely monitoring all and doing all of the capital needs assessments across our portfolio. This is something that won't happen in the future, obviously, as we have now created a mechanism to avoid that. And I think at that time, the determination was, let's move forward with repairs. So that was an option, and it was a viable option for a period of time until it no longer was. And so I think, quite frankly, it's not excusable, but I think at the time there was a solution other than full replacement that was before the team and the staff at that time. And that included a much less expensive investment. And that was a short-term repair.
Well, I hear you for the fire panel being an original equipment going back to 1968. How we thought we could continue to put Band-Aids on it, I don't understand. The other question I have, you suggested when you started out something about your $250,000 limit and that you went forward with something.
Limited notice to proceed so that, because as you may see, there's going to be quite a period of time. It takes up to 14 weeks for the on-site work, for them to begin to order certain equipment so that we can move forward, for them to scope it out, begin to get the work together for submittal for permits. So that we would not delay, because obviously we could have taken a different approach, which would have had an emergency board meeting and brought the full matter to the board all at one time. But because we had DevFin and a board meeting coming up, was able to move forward with my limited notice to proceed so that they could get started and then subsequently seek the board's support for the remainder.
From the BF&A perspective, I would question whether you have the ability to do that.
Under an emergency?
Because you're saying you have it because you've got $250,000 authority, but your $250,000 authority does not extend to something that we know is going to cost more than $250,000. So therefore, I think what would have been required would have been some kind of an emergency session with the commission to get the approval. I really think our procurement policy does not allow you to, in fact, initiate something that we know is going to cost more than your $250,000.
Well, and I will defer to our general counsel who could come back to the board and provide guidance. But I will say that, of course, from my perspective, if there is an emergency such as a fire watch issue, I would not want to delay. I want to be able to move forward. Obviously, the procurement policy does allow for sole source. especially in the event of an emergency. And so, but of course, defer to our general counsel to give us guidance on that as we move forward. This was my first experience with an emergency circumstance, and using my best judgment, felt like it was definitely important to move forward and to ensure that we do not delay. There's a $6,000 consequence per week, and we were able to still bring it to committee and to board without having to have an emergency meeting.
Well, I hear that, but I think that we really do need to understand what the policy is. I think we could have, nobody's going to question the emergency nature of the action. But I think we do have to have some limits in terms of how far you can go without board approval. And I think we discussed that in the past. I don't think that's been followed in this particular instance. Look forward to what the general counsel says in terms of what the current policy allows or doesn't.
But limbo projects are really hard, right? You've got a plan and it gets delayed and out of your control. So I'm curious what other items maybe are outstanding there that could creep up. You've got a plan, it's out of your control. You don't know where the courts are going. I'm just curious, John or Chelsea, what else is there, if anything?
The major systems that we've reviewed are in good order. Asset management has been on site. We've talked with engineers and we've walked through the building. Nothing else of a significant nature is in our purview.
And I was curious if the legal issues don't work out, what your plan is. You hinted at it, Chelsea, a little bit, that maybe you'd re-syndicate or something else.
We would obviously come back to the board for recommendation and guidance in regards to the next steps with this parcel. At the time that the legal proceedings began, we were in the process of disposing of this particular site with a potential owner who would be inclined to make all of the capital repairs and increase the affordability of the site. So that was the step that we were exploring at that time. That's not the case at this point, and I think it will really be a matter for reevaluation in terms of how we move forward. And we'll have to come back to the board to discuss.
Do you want to increase the R4R deposit you make every month, or is that not necessary, you think?
I don't think it's necessary.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think just on that note, it sounds like, and hopefully this was something unique to this property. But, as we had talked about with the roofs, back when that was happening, like just making sure that there aren't other issues that, like, if this is an issue at other properties or anywhere else, obviously, and John, it's great that you're here now and, reviewing all of this. So, but obviously we prefer not to be dealing with emergency requests, especially ones that have to do with life and safety. So if there are no additional questions, is there a motion to support the staff's recommendation and to send this to the full commission?
Second.
All in favor, say aye. Aye. The motion is approved.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The next item on our agenda has to do with a 9% LIHTC application for our project at Gankirk Farms. President Andrews.
Thank you.
Can I just ask a question before you get to that? Since we don't have a commission meeting until the 13th, what happens between now and then?
The notice to proceed that was issued gives the ability for the contractor to move forward
Sure.
with all of those preliminary activities, so we don't lose time. Okay. Wonderful. All right, well, this matter is related to Gankirk Farms Apartments. We are looking forward to submitting an application in hopes to receive 9% LIHTC for this property. And I will turn it over to our real estate division and some of our our team. I think everyone should introduce themselves since there's some new faces to give context related to this request.
Good morning, Commissioners. My name is Kyo Kavalaza. I'm a senior financial analyst at the real estate industry.
Good morning, I'm Walker Taylor, financial analyst, real estate development. Zach Marks, Chief Real Estate Officer, or I guess Senior Vice President of Real Estate. Nice to meet you again.
So as President Andrews mentioned, this is our request to authorize staff to submit an application for 9% tax credits, which the deadline for the application is December 15th. So we're actively working on preparing the application, and I'll briefly outline some of the characteristics of the property that we believe would make it very competitive for 9% tax credit award. So this is a 184 unit multifamily property in Clarksburg, located at Shawnee Lane and Observation Drive. And this development was first presented to the commission in February of 2021 and was approved by the commission in March of that year. This is a ground lease based development, and the commission has entered into a ground lease for this property, a 99-year ground lease in September of 2021. So the property, we worked with the development and design team to make the property characteristics competitive for a 9% award, and that includes the unit mix, which has 30% 3-bedroom units, which is significantly higher than a normal for this kind of development. Another 30% or 28% is 2-bedroom, 2-bathroom units, which is also suited for family occupancy. And these kind of unit mix allows us to maximize the points in that category. The building is also has green design characteristics such as LEED Platinum and Energy Star. It's fully electric and net zero energy ready. Will be when it's built, and passive. It will be conform to passive house. Design characteristics. So, in addition, the accessibility, beyond conforming with the ADA requirements and standard requirements, the building will be designed to conform to universal design principles, which add a few features to the building design, such as wide doors and corridors, and elevators on every floor. That would allow residents to continue living in these at this property as they age, and would make it suitable and adaptable to different kinds of target populations. So we are also working with a nonprofit called Family Residencies and Essential Enterprise. Family Residencies and Essential Enterprise. It's abbreviated FREE, and they provide services to special needs population, and we will likely include an MOU from them to add a few units, some percentage of units to serve target population. So with special needs, with special housing needs. So, the points that we project to receive are very high, and like I said, would make the project competitive. We're working on some other things to make it even higher, potentially. But the process for the submission, as I mentioned, deadline is December 15th, and we expect the decision by April of next year. I can answer any questions.
No.
Would you tell me a little bit more about what FREE does?
So they provide, they're out of New York. They've done a lot of work in New York. They provide services for people that have target populations that have special housing needs, such as injury. People have had injuries, different kinds of injuries. They have mental health issues, behavioral health, substance abuse issues. They have many different target populations, and not all of them may work at Garnkirk, but they've reviewed our unit design features, and they will propose a plan to target some groups.
So they're going to propose a plan that affects the design, or are they going to be a contractor who will work with these families during the course of their occupancy?
They will provide the services. They will suggest, they will work with our design team and our development team to redesign units, and units are very adaptable and should accommodate most of the requirements for the special needs populations. And so as when after we agree to the number of units and the features, we'll incorporate those in the design of the building, but they will be providing services.
And how do we accommodate the cost of that?
So that we haven't gotten to that point yet. We're still at the MOU. They will propose an MOU, and they will propose the percentage of units that they would like to have available for the target populations. We'll update the commission as that process progresses. But there will be a cost component to provide the services.
Well, following up on the conversation we had before, how does that consistent with our procurement policy in terms of sole source, which I guess we're doing here?
Well, I think for the tax credit application, we would propose including or providing these units for target populations. If the commission and staff feel that this should be,
I'm not really questioning targeting them for the special populations. I'm just trying to get us to recognize that we do have some procurement policies in place, and we need to be consistent. And also, are we making a commitment now that we don't know what it's going to cost, and somebody's going to have to approve that later? I mean, that's part of what I'm hearing. I absolutely don't disagree with it. I also don't know whether there are other entities that provide that kind of a service. But it seems to me that that's something we need to address, because if you go with a tax credit application, we are absolutely committed to doing that. And I think it's a good thing. But I don't know that we know how we're going to pay for it, and whether it's consistent with our procurement policy, and or whether we need some kind of waiver. So that's a question that I would have.
Yeah, I don't know if this is on or not, but yeah, so just to again kind of build on what you had said. So this is really just the application to provide the kind of units that you've hit upon. The issue. There are other firms that can provide these. We're, as an example, in Metro Point, we have a relationship with Rosario where they're providing that sort of service for about, I think, 6 units, 10 units, something like that. Similar arrangement. And so we would bring the ultimate selection of the provider, at a later point. We're working under the state gave us about 90 days to respond to this. They announced the round, and it was kind of like, a race, but we're confident that it is not a big, neither capital nor operating cost impact from providing these units. Again, having had some experience at Metro Point, but also in just having these conversations, this building has been fully designed. It's fully entitled and designed. So it was really a question to them of, is this for the most part going to work? We can tweak some stuff, but we can't really change that much. And so we're confident it's not a large, that we're not talking about a meaningful operating or capital change as a result of including these units. And that ultimately we will bring the selection of the firm that would provide that to you all, and it would obviously need to be compliant.
Okay. And again, I want to suggest that I, and I'm sure our former Commissioner Simon, fully support what the staff is doing and appreciate it. I don't recall what process we went through with Rosario. Did we have to go out to bid? Do you remember how we did that?
My review, which is, will be obviously much more thorough when we bring it, but in my review of the history of the program, they were just, as a service provider, there was a sense that we were acting more as a conduit as opposed to we're awarding a contract and then we're paying them money. And so it's a procurement. It appears the commission back then approached it more as like, we're providing a platform for these services to be provided. The money, whether it's through the Medicaid exemptions or through grants, is really being procured for. It's same as our relationship with Jubilee and the single family homes. We're kind of providing a platform. We're not really, we're not really leasing anything for money. We're not really providing money to this. We're not paying the contract. We're not paying the provider. That it's really a platform for these. So in past similar situations, it looks like, there was a nonprofit that had a good idea. We were able to figure out how to integrate them in what we were already doing. And there wasn't really a contractual relationship. So the commission just moved forward because the public good was evident, self-evident. It was a nonprofit. It was for a specific purpose. And there wasn't really a contractual relationship per se.
Again, as I said, I don't remember what processes we went through. But I would also suggest, and particularly in view of your comments, that our application and in fact the package, if we haven't selected the entity that will provide those services, we should say that we're going to select an entity to provide the services and not specifically mention free, unless the commission itself is going to endorse identifying and committing to that entity at this point. And I think there's some issues that we ought to consider in terms of to what extent are we committing to that entity when we identify them and submit an application that identifies.
Do you have to identify them to get the points?
Pardon me?
I think
let's see the best way to answer this. So
you probably need to identify service providers to get the points. Otherwise, it's just words.
We need to, I said so, and this is true throughout this application. So, for instance, we need to provide, in certain cases, this is one of them. We need to show a viable partner. It doesn't have to be the partner, but it needs to be a viable partner because they need to see that we're not just.
They have to submit a plan that says ABC, and you're not necessarily pregnant.
Right.
Maybe you're pregnant in terms of having to do the services, but you can switch around. But if you just say I'm doing it and I'll just, you don't get any points probably.
Yeah, and with for instance like the 4%, which is what we usually do. We don't usually. I mean, this is the first application in my 11 years we've even bothered to submit because the program is. Montgomery County does not do well within this program, as I know you know. So we don't even usually bother, except that this was such a good opportunity. We just figured let's take a shot. So normally you're more used to the 4% where it's rolling. You show up when you're ready, so we can get our ducks in the row a little bit more. Whereas here, they announced it I think in September, and you got 90 days to get studies and everything else done, and so. And they know that, and the state knows that, and they're aware that, like, for instance, you may say that somebody's the property management firm for this deal, and the main thing is that you're committing to provide someone like that, so someone who's consistent with that level of quality, and they understand that not everybody has everything together. And in fact, one of the advantages of Garnkirk over some of the other applicants is that most applicants to the 9% round are not nearly as far along as we are in terms of like being ready to pull permits in 8 months, something like that. Like most of these, there are projects that are going to go in for this that don't even have site plan approval yet. This is obviously a project that's much further along, but the state is aware that like they called around, you have some stuff ready, some stuff not, and you just need to demonstrate that you understand what kinds of partners are going to be required. They're going to ultimately look to in order to give you your allocation.
They just don't score if you don't identify.
No, I heard you, but again, it just seems to me that if in fact we're identifying and have to identify, then the commission should be aware that we are in fact identifying, and thereby there's a commitment, at least ostensibly a commitment to those entities. What other entities are we identifying that maybe the commission should be aware of?
Yeah, so the core ones for the 9% round, because with 4%, it's more of a, it's a lot less of an issue, but in the 9% round, they score the general contractor and they score the property manager as well, or you want to talk about?
The investors,
Investor.
we would have to provide LOI, non-binding letter from an investor as well.
And,
But those are all, yeah.
right, and do you want to identify them?
We're still working with a couple of general contractors to get the, potential budget, and that's not, hasn't been finalized yet. I think for the property management for now, HOC will be listed. And I think the plan is to ask R4 to serve as our standing tax rate investment.
And it's consistent with what we've done before when we need to identify and haven't yet gone through, the process of selection with the commission. It's standard practice to identify a firm that is acceptable with the idea that if you ultimately make a different decision, they just want to be informed. So as one example, on Waverly House, and this is for different reasons, but with Waverly House, the general contractor we had in the original application, we wound up switching. We had to let the HCD know. They needed to evaluate that new contractor, which they were ultimately comfortable with. And so they understand that these things can change, and they certainly don't want the process to, preclude you all from either having to decide between submitting at all but also, going through the necessary process for selecting. So in all these cases, these are firms that understand, they would like to be, they're interested, they like to be a part of this, but they understand that this is simply for us to be able to demonstrate what we need to demonstrate to get an accepted application.
Don't you love it? Ready, set, go, 90 days. Man. I was curious about, like you mentioned management, but who the GPs are, is HOC just the GP? Is it a joint venture? How's the developer fee split up?
Yeah, I believe Duffy's well, it's a ground lease. Duffy owns the like at Hillendale Gateway, and HOC leases the land, 99-year ground lease, and HOC is the general, controls the property and is a general partner.
Yeah, so we're 100% of the GP on the tax credit deal. And what's the fee arrangement with the dog?
I would have to look that up.
It's probably the standard 80-20, but it's on a percentage that is a conventional. So very similar to at Hillendale, where there's a split of fees, but the percentage fee paid that's being split is not a tax credit level fee. So if you all may recall that.
So this is going to be condominiumized like
yeah.
that.
Well, in this case with Garnkirk, it's just there's only one building.
Right.
They have no interest in it. It's ours. Okay. And so the split there is 80-20, but it's 80-20 on I think a 4% fee or a 5% fee or something like that. Whereas under the tax credit program, you earn 10-12% development fees. So that's 100% ours. So it would be really our net position would be that tax credit fee, which would be much larger versus the development fee we're paying them for just having developed the site. So similar like Hillendale Gateway, where it's a nominal 80-20 split with Duffy on that transaction. But once you weigh in the fact that we get 100% of any tax credit fees, it's closer to like, I don't know, 55-45, because under the development fee program, the fee percentage is usually at least twice as large, if not more, if that makes sense. It's hard to do without an exhibit.
Yeah, be good to write some of this down. Since it's going to be in the application anyway.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, the development fee piece was obviously struck back when the commission entered this deal.
Yeah,
to begin with, this is a 9% deal, this wasn't plan A, but we knew this was a shot we wanted to take if the round timing worked out, and it has. So this was definitely something we wanted to put in. And then ultimately, if we're successful, we'll come around with all the typical development plan, finance plan, stuff like that. But if we're not, then we would come back with plan A, which is we don't expect to win 9%.
And who's giving the guarantees?
HOC.
So they get 20%. It'd be good to I think anyway, it'd be good to have this written. out
Yeah,
just
well, and we
as a
can
standard-
provide
Standard
the-
operating
We
procedure.
can provide the
That'd be
packet,
great.
the materials.
Yeah, just breaking out who's going to guarantees, where the cash goes.
Yep.
Who's.
Yeah, but on the big difference here is that unlike Hillendale, on the building itself, in terms of ownership and interest and that sort of thing, it's HOC is 100% the owner of the vertical building. Whereas at Hillendale, it's, I think, something like 91.
And their 20%, if I got it right, is bringing you the deal and having it all put together. Is that?
Yeah, so it's 80% them on the fee, 20% us, because this deal was
Oh.
completely entitled when we
Okay.
entered it. They had already done all the development work, but for really finishing the construction documents headed toward permitting. This was a transaction that they had completely entitled before we even showed up. So they had actually done all the pre-development work before we even entered.
Let me just chime in here. What we can do, Commissioner Simon,
Solomon.
Solomon.
But she's very
is-
popular and I hear all
I
I also hear
apologize.
things about her. So if that works for me.
Saying this to Simon, but in any event, we will provide you with the board materials from back in 2021 is when this was presented to the board initially. There's a couple of presentations that came to the board that ultimately led us to move forward. That will give you the background.
And maybe if you added a memo, I would find it useful of what the development fee is you anticipate, cash fee, and where it goes and that kind of thing. Since you're going to put it in the application anyway. I just think we should just do that normally. It would save time.
Well, and under the tax credit application, Duffy's not going to be identified because they're not actually 100% of that fee comes to us. So it's, yeah. But for our purposes, yeah, we definitely want to be clear that like, if we were to be awarded 9s or if we were to wind up doing a 4% deal, same thing would apply where there'd be a much larger development fee coming through the tax credit program that completely belongs to us. And so you've got this fee over here, you're paying them for having really designed the whole thing, but we're earning this thing 100%. So there's really a net position where this number is going to be bigger than this one in this case. So.
Yeah, write
So
it down.
exactly.
Lovely.
Yes.
Thank you.
It seems to me that one of the things we ought to do in preparing for the commission meeting is to prepare and this isn't a negative, it's a more complete and informed package that brings everything together. I mean, I know it's not part of the tax credit application, but rather than having to go back and see what we did in 2021 with the Garkirk approvals, we are now moving ahead with this application. The background memo should in fact spell out all of this stuff so that you can look at one document and find out what it is that the commission is doing, has done, is committed to, rather than requiring anybody, including us, to have to go back and look at 4 different pieces of paper.
And a lot of the memos have done that recently. So, I think that's a reasonable.
Is it a taxable bond you're going to, or, does the commission benefit from that? Or, just, and you don't have to answer this all now, but just, so we can see the full picture of how HOC benefits and what their role is. And it would save time in the meetings, of course. But you're really busy with 90 days. Right? Like, that's what I get.
Yeah, well, we were waiting for, almost a year and a half, we kept like, are you ready? Are you ready? Are you ready? And then of course, how about 90 days? So.
Are there any additional questions? If not, is there a motion to support staff's recommendation and send this to the full commission?
I'm sorry.
Sure.
Would you, at the full commission, would you have all that detail for us so that everyone could see that?
What I am going to do
Go
after
ahead.
this meeting is talk to the team, I actually haven't had a chance to look back at all of the materials either. And so we will provide the comprehensive information on what was provided to the extent we have the details in regards to the split and all the information you're asking. We will definitely provide that.
Thank you. Motion.
Recommendation for approval.
Second.
Okay. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Motion is approved. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next up is a discussion on the Springville Terrace, approval to submit a Faircloth to RAD application, RAD being the Rental Assistance Demonstration Program for 48 units at Springvale Terrace.
Thank you. This is a matter, commissioners, that really comes before us as a request from one of our peers and partners in the work we do, enterprise community development. They have asked us to support one of the projects that they're moving forward on in a creative way that we look forward to hopefully supporting them in. To the ability to transition your Faircloth to RAD, which will provide an additional operating supplement subsidy, more than the ACC subsidy that's typically affiliated with Faircloth units. And so we'll provide more details in regards to this particular request, but this is an interesting and new approach that HUD has allowed and that many other housing authorities are working through in terms of how best to leverage and where we can support our peers who are developing affordable housing across the county and where it won't create any unnecessary or undue burden on us or even financial burden on us. We definitely want to take those steps to support. And so want to provide you with more details. Zach Marks will give the additional context.
Thank you, President Andrews. For the record, Zachary Marks, Senior Vice President of Real Estate. So the Springvale, this Springvale item is fairly straightforward in that really the request is they're looking for us to provide up to 48 project-based Section 8 units, but not via our housing choice vouchers or any of our existing complement. We have under the Faircloth Amendment there's like a headline number that housing authorities are allowed to have in the way of a public housing inventory count. When we completed RAD, we actually, as you know, we currently have no public housing, right? We completed the exit of public housing, still keeping control and ownership of all our properties, but moving it from Section 9 to Section 8. And but in doing that, HUD, as we were exiting the program, let us know that, hey, we think in the future, and this was a couple of years ago, we think in the future, we may come up with some ideas that actually allows you to use what's left of your sort of Faircloth capacity, which is just this number in a spreadsheet of how many units we have left. And that number for us is around 700. And so when we finished RAD, our portfolio conversion, we very explicitly did not check a box that says, also, we want to salt the earth and never do public housing again. We left that open because we knew that this could potentially come down the road where HUD could make enough changes where it's viable to even place this Faircloth capacity. So one first important detail is that if you either recall or you have done RAD deals, the subsidy that comes from the RAD program, the payment standards for RAD vouchers is not the same as fair market rent. So like when a resident with a housing choice voucher goes out into the market, they're using the small area FMRs, which are 60% and above in terms of AMI. When our RAD vouchers, when our public housing was converting, it was converting at the public housing level of support, which was around 35% of AMI. And so for HOC, when we were converting those buildings, we had with our financing, one of the things we had to figure out is, well, how do we deal with having a lower level of subsidy that's basically covering maybe operations? How do you turn that into enough capital to renovate or build new? And ultimately, we figured that out by raising a bunch of different capital sources. But we had to raise capital sources to basically offset the fact that these vouchers don't, or these Section 8 vouchers don't pay as much as they normally would. And so the Faircloth to RAD program is really the same thing. It's the only difference is that RAD was taking existing public housing and converting it to Section 8 at the level of support those public housing properties we're receiving. Under Faircloth, there aren't any existing ones. It's just saying if you have 700 units left, we'll give you public housing funding, the public housing level of support for 700 units. And then what you do is you basically build it as public housing, but as soon as it's ready to be placed in service, you convert it via RAD to project-based Section 8. So it's the same idea that we're getting these impaired subsidies. It's still subsidy, it's still valuable. And what it really helps us do is get units that are between kind of 30 and 50% AMI already and turns them into full-fledged subsidized units. And so in this case, Enterprise had been working on this project, Springvale Terrace, for a couple of years to redevelop this existing senior community. And DHCA, they had already secured DHCA support to do that. And with DHCA support came obviously commitments to different levels of affordability. So in this building, they have units that go from 30% AMI to 80% AMI. So it's a good place to pair Faircloth to RAD, because if you already have units that are kind of down in the 30s and 40s, there's not going to be a big hit to the pro forma if you introduce these lower than usual payment, this lower payment standard than usual voucher. So, but one of the things that was important to us is that we as staff were happy to recommend being a conduit for these vouchers. Just as a comparison, we had 877 public housing multifamily units that we converted under RAD, and it took us 10 years. So 700 units, in order to get these units on the ground and serving people, if we were to try to do it all ourselves, you're probably looking at 10 years to do so. And that's a lot of families not being served. So we really saw, and we did this in RAD too, where we found we found nonprofit partners that were already doing deals and said, will you take some of these? And in this case, though, the new requirement is that we didn't want to have to provide any additional financial support. We're happy to give you access to this 48. DHCA said we are absolutely willing to step up for any additional financial support because it's such a win for the county to get subsidized units on the ground. So the proposal here is really simply for us to submit an application to use up to 48 units of our capacity at Springvale Terrace. That's the only thing the commission would be providing, is really the conduiting of those vouchers. If there's an impact on the pro forma that causes it to need additional funding, DHCA has committed to providing that additional funding. So that's not something that HOC is committing to at all. We're not committing to anything else other than conduiting these 48 vouchers. And we think it's a great deployment because it gets them into service much faster. They don't have a very high payment standard. And so you have a deal where they're actually compatible. And that's great, because that's one of the biggest challenges, is even coming up with the funding to offset those lower payment standards. So we would ask for your recommendation to the commission on submitting an application for up to 48 units for Springvale Terrace.
Thank you. No, this sounds like a great partnership opportunity and a great opportunity to do something with these remaining allocated units. I just, out of curiosity, and this wouldn't be any reason not to do it, will this allow them to do any additional units, subsidized units, or is this just purely additional subsidy for them for units that they're already going to have at a lower rate?
So if we want to go 3 slides back. It has a table on it with some the unit mix. You guys go 3 slides back, please. Yeah, perfect. So the unit mix in the top right there, it may be slide 4 on yours, but I know we had some issues with pagination. So none of these units is subsidized currently. So these have obviously deeper and deeper levels of rent restriction, but there's no actual subsidy provided otherwise around these units. So what it would basically do is turn all of the 30% units and a few of the 50% units into fully subsidized, so that now for 48 units, if you have, no income, you can live at the property. So that's really the key here is it's taking units that are already definitely deeply affordable and are achieving good outcome, but it's now turning them into full-blown subsidized units that can serve anybody.
Is this an assisted living facility?
So the existing property called Springvale Terrace, I wish they had picked a working name that was not the same as the existing one, but here we are. So the existing property, it wasn't assisted living, was full-blown like tier 1, 2, 3 assisted living. The new property is simply active adult. There's no assistance provided.
I haven't reread, that was not clear to me when I read this.
Yes.
That it's no longer going to be assisted living.
It's definitely confusing
Coming
because
from HOC and our wonderful experience with Kensington, I shudder when I think about assisted living in terms of
yes.
Of us and our involvement in it.
Yes.
The other thing is, in the original that I read, there was something that suggested there was some possibility of us having to add some additional subsidy.
Yeah, so again, clarity, I take all responsibility for lack of clarity. So this was probably on slide 4, the one that says FQR placement overview.
Where?
What I was trying to communicate is that when under our RAD deals, so the previous deals that we have done that were similar with RAD deals, when the subsidy dollars came up short, it was HOC that needed to contribute additional equity. But under this situation, we are explicitly not committing to any of that at all. So that's where DHGA would play out.
So in terms of ongoing, I mean, what we're committing to is giving them the 48 units and whatever the 35% of AMI is in terms of the monthly subsidy. And they got to figure out how to get the rest. And they supposedly have an agreement from DHCA to cover the shortfall.
Yes.
For how long? I mean, because they're going to figure if they can't make it work operationally, and if DHCA changes and you have new folks or new programs or no money, then what happens?
Yeah. So the shortfall being covered is basically the shortfall in the senior proceeds. So one answer is that DHCA is covering the period of time that is equal to the length of the senior mortgage, which I assume in this case is somewhere between 30 and 40 years. So when they get to the end of that, it's now an existing property. They would, if they want to re-syndicate, they need to raise that capital again. But one of the other things, it's not explicitly in here, but that we have communicated to with talking to our director of housing resources to make sure that Director Hayes is on board, that the form of this will be a PBRA contract, so a HAP contract as opposed to PBV, because if we put these there as public project-based vouchers, HOC would actually be involved in the administration of that. But we've said that you're going to take this in the form of PBRA, which is a HAP contract with HUD. So they will have that HAP contract will govern what happens if they, if they default or if there's some other sort of compliance issue. So HUD and the owner of the borrower will be, engaged in that way, and it's not something that HOC will have to enforce.
So this is bottom line, really no different from our giving PBRA units to another nonprofit where we don't have any continuing financial responsibility.
Precisely. And even slightly more disengaged, because when we do an RFP around HCVs, we still have administration of PBVs. In this case, that's even getting pushed to HUD. So like, for instance, if you look at our RAD contracts on our properties, most of them are PBRA for other reasons. And our contract is actually with that HAP contract is actually with HUD. And so it's even further disengaged than those.
Again, I haven't reread
Yeah,
or read the rewrite of this.
apologize for
Is
that.
it clear that we don't have any continuing ongoing financial responsibility?
It is, and based on this feedback, obviously, what we produce for commission, we will,
Okay, I'd be able to sleep better.
yes.
Are there any additional questions?
Congratulations on not having any public
Yes,
housing.
that's good. I would move support.
All in favor, say aye. Aye. The motion is approved. Thank you.
You.
Let's see, the next item on our agenda is a discussion of our scattered sites and portfolio capital and operations plan.
Thank you. Commissioners, this is really a good milestone for us. As the commission knows, we have been evaluating and analyzing our scattered sites portfolio for quite some time, and having an opportunity to bring in some key leaders to look at how we approach our scattered sites in a more holistic way that ultimately will be a sustainable model for our agency. I will just indicate here that this presentation today does not entail any request for action. It is truly an opportunity to just provide context and or our initial thoughts and recommendations related to how we would proceed with this asset. Scattered Sites has been before this commission on a number of occasions, typically as it pertains to thinking through how to finance scattered sites, in many instances, thinking through how we address the capital needs of our scattered sites. Of course, the board is fully aware of how challenging it is to service our scattered sites as it pertains to property management and maintenance. We've brought together our team of very astute leaders to really think about and work comprehensively, to really work together to create a comprehensive plan. And so you will hear today from our Vice President of Asset Management an overview of how we intend to approach today's presentation, but you will hear from each of our leaders in terms of their lens and their perspective on how we can best optimize our scattered sites. And I'll turn it over to start with our Vice President of Asset Management, John Wilhoit.
Thank you, Madam President. My name is John Wilhoit, Vice President of Asset Management. Yes, it's pretty much well. I'm joined by Zachary Marks, Senior Vice President of Real Estate, by Ali Alzair, our Vice President of Property Management, and Sean Asbury of Property Management and Maintenance, all of whom will have some words to say along the way. This is an exciting time to be in this business. If you're doing standard multifamily asset management, you do a capital needs assessment every 5 years and you know where to go. How do you do that with a scattered site portfolio? How do you do that with a habitational scattered site portfolio, where the length of time is not 20 years or 50 years? It's really now because of the age of the portfolio, and it needs to be addressed in a timely fashion. To go into slide 1, which is where we are now, slide 2, excuse me.
That is one activity of green light on at least the audio is working, and of course, stacking the lumber is called.
That's the forever photo.
I think certain cameras freeze up now and then.
That's the forever photo right there.
But that's a fitting picture for Zach. Zach always has a cup of coffee.
We'll continue.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate you reminding me about that.
Those worst things.
Okay. I think I skimmed over it also, but it does say, so we'll be.
I'm not sure whether that was in the original.
I wondered as well,
I mean,
'cause I didn't.
but this.
Yeah.
But it might have been, and I just skipped it.
I missed it as well. So I had the same.
Certain place and time. Yeah, not now. Management. I'm just going to pass this deck over to you when it gets to your slide. Yes, yeah, yeah. If we had had time to reorder the deck, I would have given Sean 2 or 3. But based on the order,
The camera issue has been resolved, but I know that Commissioner Solomon.
We can go ahead and continue.
we're here to discuss HOC scattered site portfolio and a strategic update, a sustainable approach to capital expenditures and operations. With respect to multifamily asset management, we do a 20-year plan, we do a property capital needs assessment, and you pretty much have a path forward. When it comes to a scattered site portfolio, particularly of habitational assets, which age out sooner and cannot be on a consistent schedule holistically throughout the entire portfolio, it's harder. We all know that. And this is our initial discussion on how to begin to address that with respect to our scattered site portfolio. You'll see on slide 2 that we have what is in essence a life cycle analysis of how we treat a single unit and the units and this processes that goes through to maintain not just affordability, but habitation. Because as a single unit, particularly with how many townhomes that we have, it's a larger chore to accomplish holistically. So from lease up to turnover through modernization and turnover again is an extended period. In the multifamily marketplace, turnover is about 50% per year. In our HOC portfolio, it's about 20% per year. So we're not turning units often. And when we do, they do require extensive upgrading, if not upgrading, at least extensive work to get back to ready market, or as our president says, ready. She doesn't like just ready. It's got to be ready. So to get to ready requires, after 5 years of habitation, a little more elbow grease than it would otherwise. Next slide, please. I wanted to make a distinguishing comment on the difference between asset management and property management. Asset management is the owner's representative, and we act as if the properties are our own and for long-term benefit. Property managers are our partners in every sense of the way that you can say partnership, but responsible for day-to-day operations. And that's how we act concurrently, with property management having day-to-day and asset management having a longer-term view. And when I say long-term, I mean for the entire time of ownership, all the way through disposition, if that's in fact what we do. The elements of effective asset management are capital expenditure and renovations, and making sure those occur on a timely map. Maintenance planning, developing a proactive maintenance plan to preserve long-term property value. Renovation and upgrades to evaluate the needs and impact of renovations and upgrades on the property's overall performance. So again, in multifamily, we can do that, right? We have 100, 200 units in one place. When you have 1,000, 2,000 units scattered, that's a different animal altogether, including how we go about financing that. As you are aware, we have refinanced a part of the scattered site portfolio long-term, but that's only about 40% of the total, which leaves the 60% in a position to do other things with.
JW, we're on a different slide.
Oh, slide 3, please.
Yeah.
Slide 3, please. Keys to effective asset management. Yes. Under keys to effective asset management, portfolio optimization is through proactive asset management, which means performance monitoring and performance reporting. And we want the reporting to be ongoing and consistent, because what you measure is what improves. Dispositions in this case, with respect to the scattered site portfolio, is only of consideration for underperforming assets or those that we've decided, the commission has decided not to save based on the fact that the capital needs are so extensive, we have to make that A-B decision, right? If we want to put that much money into that particular deal or sell and preserve that equity to reinvest in a new purchase or to reinvest in the existing scattered site portfolio. Last is acquisitions, and acquisitions are only relevant as it comes to with respect to this discussion when it comes to dispositions, because we do want to keep one for one. We do want to make sure that we retain or expand the portfolio as the commission desires. So acquisitions are only considered, and again, for purposes of this discussion, if we're looking at dispositions. Next slide, please. For this presentation, this slide is really the nexus of the discussion for your consideration and contemplation. The key elements here that we're discussing are a clarity of business model for the scattered site portfolio. Really a rebranding of the scattered site assets within the HOC portfolio as a business unit represented as a valuable asset with public purpose. It represents a business unit that is a stellar representation of how to deploy affordable housing throughout the region, geographic diversity, and to retain the best of these assets and redeploy capital for improvement and replacement as an essential strategy to maintaining sustainability. It's a very valuable public purpose asset, and I'd like for us to keep it that way, which means we have to do something about the average age of the portfolio. The key elements to sustainability are cash flow enhancements from proactive property management, which means retaining revenue, retaining occupancy, appropriate and reinvestment via rolling redevelopment. We can't do everything all at once, of course, but we can deploy CapEx over time. Performance management, which is back to asset management, reviewing revenue and OpEx monitoring on a consistent basis. Financing structure, making sure we don't over leverage and tilt the portfolio strictly for the sake of financing. And considering selective dispositions of vintage or older assets and replacing it with newer, while continuing our geographic dispersion throughout the county. Next slide, please. It's slide 5. Thank you. The average age of the scattered site portfolio is approaching 40 years. That's old. So anything we can do to improve on that average age will improve on the long-term sustainability of the portfolio as a whole. Next slide, please. Approximately 60% of the portfolio in its entirety are townhomes. And you'll see on here that 1,100 of those are 3-bedroom, but they're 3-bedroom, 1 bath. And as much as it says 3-bedroom, 1.9 baths, it's not 2 baths. So in today's environment with larger families, a 3-bedroom with 1 bath is not as functional as it could be. And those are the older units. Most of these were built in the 80s and 90s, and anything that would be
Especially if
purchased,
they have teenagers.
especially if they have teenagers. But anything built in the 80s and 90s would be evolved into something newer. And I'm not suggesting it would be brand new, but it would likely have a 2-bathroom unit with 3 bedrooms or more. Next slide, please. This is a heat map that depicts concentrations of where our existing portfolio is, which is in Germantown, Gaithersburg, Montgomery Village, Olney, and Lay-Hill. And that follows the path of construction in those 1980s, 1990s timeline. So we do anticipate the geographic dispersion will increase as we buy new units. But today's date, I can't tell you where, right? We have to know where that new construction is taking place and where the opportunities present themselves. Next, you'll hear from Zachary Marks, Vice President, Real Estate, Senior Vice President.
Next slide, please. So one of the other challenges, the foremost challenge with this portfolio is just simply the sheer capital need of it. But one of the secondary challenges is that many of these, when HOC originally acquired these units, HOC put them into many different programs that by and large now aren't applicable anymore to the scatter site program, but still have significant regulation on them, extended use covenants. And, these are, again, they're 40-year, you have 40-year old single family wood frame properties with, 30, 40, 50 years of continued affordability covenants on them. And one of the things that so when you marry that with the physical issue of the property, you really get a mismatch in a way that you don't get in multifamily. With multifamily, the extended use is okay because you can resyndicate, you can renovate, you can refinance, you can recapitalize in a way that allows you to continue to meet the affordability goals without having to, but also still be able to meet the physical needs goals, because obviously we don't just want housing to be affordable. We want it to be high quality. And so one of the important things here is that, staff is going to be spending assuming that you agree, but we're going to be spending some time really evaluating which of these kinds of restrictions can be released, not so that the property necessarily goes to market rate or those things, but it just puts us in the best, most flexible position to continue to deliver the affordability. But if we need to do it with a different unit in order to, again, provide an affordable unit that is high quality, then we can do that. Or to be able to, to generate additional proceeds to be able to renovate that unit. And of course, none of those things would be taken. Without commission approval. We would bring all these things based on this idea, but we just want you to know that, when you see us bring specific action as it relates to the scatter site portfolio, one of the core themes is going to be making sure that legacy regulation isn't preventing us from being able to serve the resident. And in many cases, as you can see, there's tons of different programs here, tons of different restrictions, and none of them are particularly helpful with meeting the physical needs of these assets. Next slide, please.
The next slide is for Sean.
Is that for Sean? Sean.
Next, you hear from Sean Asbury. It's back to you.
Is that better? Okay. All right, thank you. I'm here this morning to present HOC's reinvestment framework as it relates to scattered sites renovations. To date, 39% of our scattered site properties have been renovated since the acquisition, leaving about 1,063 unrenovated units. Now, these renovations took place between 2011 and 2017 as part of the Section 18 disposition in batches of 50 to 100 units. Since that time, HOC has faced numerous obstacles in restarting this renovation process for the remainder of the portfolio. For example, several of the general contracts that we worked with in the past, these renovations changed course and went into the multifamily construction instead. That coupled with the COVID-19 pandemic, rising construction costs, labor shortages, and rising material costs caused the staff to pause and reassess these projects. In time, the HOC staff came back to the commission with a recommendation to do smaller batches utilizing smaller contractors. So in the first batch of renovations approved by the commission on November 15, 2023, 10 units were awarded. Now that smaller branch allowed the improved prospects of minority, female, disabled, MFD contractors to be selected. These 10 units were awarded to an MFD certified firm, giving the size and scattered site nature of the scattered sites. It's pretty difficult to maintain a true estimate of outstanding needs. So the HOC staff instead recommends placing all the units on a 20-year reinvestment cycle, renovated about 87 units per year. Now, keep in mind that many of these 1,063 unrenovated units have had no meaningful renovations since their original construction, which goes back, as you heard, decades. Therefore, the first renovations may be higher, with an average cost coming in between 50 to just over $100,000 per unit. We believe these renovations will eventually settle in at about $50,000 per unit with a more consistent reinvestment. And that's the end of the presentation. I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Next slide. Part of what we wanted to deliver to you all was not just a plan, but given that the nature of this portfolio makes it a little bit easier to sort of, or a little bit harder to sort of understand, well, where really are we? And that's for two reasons. One, the properties are individual properties scattered across the entire county. By the time you've knocked on every door, it's 5 years later. So it's not as easy as it is to go to Metropolitan and say, what's the status of Metropolitan? We go there, we evaluate the building, and within a few months, we have a report that's only a few months old. Part of what's hard about this portfolio is that we're going into one unit at a time or in small numbers of units at a time, and there's so many of them that that to some degree we're only getting a majority of the picture of what the true status is, because there's just so much to monitor. But at the same time, we wanted to be able to provide you with a set of metrics that would speak to really what we view as the three key components here, which are capital, operations, and compliance. And so what you will see, in addition to us bringing forward specific actions related to, curing the physical need issue here, is that we also want you to have ongoing metrics that will be the same, that you'll be able to look at and say, okay, this is giving me at least a better sense of where we are from a capital perspective, what we're seeing as it evolves over time. As we do those 87 units of renovation every year, we get a sense of like how our construction costs trending on an operation, from an operations standpoint, helping to simplify how you all can sort of track in your minds where operations are. And we think, and then in terms of the compliance piece of this, it's another big challenge of this portfolio is recertifications, leases, and those sorts of things. Because again, at a multifamily property, there's one point of contact, everybody's there, they can funnel their documents back and forth through one point of contact. With scattered sites, it's a completely different relationship between our team and residents. And so we also wanted to create some compliance metrics so that you could know, hey, are we not leasing because it's taking us too long to process something? And so, but we also wanted to convey that these things are all interrelated. Leasing goes better if the units are renovated, and operations goes better if the units are renovated, and leasing goes better if compliance is on point. So we wanted to kind of create what amounts to a little bit of a matrix here that will help you all with, on a shorthand basis, have a sense going forward, consistently understanding where we are from those three key themes. Next slide, please. And so this slide just gives you a sense of the scope of renovations. It truly is the entire asset, inside, outside systems, landscaping, drainage, paving, and so forth. But there are obviously very high quality renovations that when we're done, they look a lot different and they serve the residents very well. Next slide. And then just sort of, Sean really, I think, satisfactorily spoke to this point, but we just wanted to convey again how significantly the market for general contractors to be able to do this work has changed, and how much harder it has become for HOC to manage the renovation of these. And so part of the reason there was this lull between the end of the VPC renovations and now is because the whole world changed around how to create a machine so that we could consistently be reinvesting in these. And so this is actually a picture from the RFP that went out for the VPC renovations. And you can see that we were able at the time to renovate many more units per year because we were able to award much larger batches because we were dealing with contractors that had much greater capacity. And that whole ecosystem is different now. And so that is part of the reason why we wanted to, so we want to marry it to the real conditions on the ground, which is, again, we think 5% of the portfolio a year is a reasonable level of renovation production and one consistent with where HOC staffing is and the general contracting capacity is. Next slide. Just making sure I'm not running over myself. You saw sort of the big headline number of what the projection looks like for 1,100 more units. But the reality is we're not doing 1,100 units at once, as we just discussed, that this is going to be 5% a yearish. And so we wanted to talk about what this really looks like from a demand on the commission's resources on an annual basis and what we have to be able to meet that need. And so again, the range here is about 4 million and change to 8 million and change of annual need. We obviously get a portion of that we get a portion of support to offset that from the county, the 1.25. And there are decent reserves, although, we prefer reserves be there for the unforeseen rather than as a source of renovation, but nonetheless, it's there. And there is there's about, there's somewhere between 10 and 20% of the overall need in that capital reserve account. So again, very, very good, healthy reserve. But that's not ultimately going to get the entire job done. And so, and the challenge is that, for these scattered sites, we used to be able to access things like the low income housing tax credit program. And when tax credit investors stopped being, their willingness to invest in these properties went away, and we lost that as a source. That is the other piece of the challenge here. So the big physical need, and now the absence of many of the tools that we have available to us on multifamily deals, where if you need equity on an affordable housing multifamily deal, you can access the tax credit market, and that will give you 30 cents on the dollar of what you need. That's a big deal. Well, it's absent for these scattered sites. So we will need to find other sources, and that's harder. And it's also harder on a portfolio that is itself harder. And so what we wanted to kind of break this all the way down to is what is the annual, what will the annual situation look like for you all as you move through this portfolio every year on an ongoing basis. Next slide. And so we think one of the strategies that we ought to consider utilizing in the absence of things like the low-income housing tax credit program is actually with targeted disposition. And what do we mean by targeted? We mean a very small portion of the portfolio annually. And it's probably something that to some extent decelerates as we go from having a portfolio that's 40 or 50 years old to having a portfolio that, as we really get onto a recurring schedule, it may mean we won't need to use it as much. But there are units, as we've seen from the 10 units that you all just awarded contractor on last meeting, that those units have $140,000 a unit in need. And just by if you sold those units for $1, you'd really be selling them for $141,000 because you'd be pushing that capital need onto the buyer. And there is a strong in the for sale market. There's a strong appetite for they don't mind that physical need because they can go do that physical need and they can get what they need through disposition. And so we feel that targeted disposition here, and again, as John mentioned earlier, to maintain the level of unit count, marrying it with acquisition of newer units that don't have that physical need, you can see the kind of role that targeted disposition can play. So on the left side, you see this graph where we're selling 1% of the portfolio per year. And again, that's 17, 18 units. So it's not a large number. And at that at that amount, it leaves us with 2.2 million after you account for the county portion. If we sold 3% of the units per year, which again, 52 units, you almost entirely eliminate the annual need out of our own other resources in order to make these renovations happen. Now, in this scenario, what we're assuming is that we would get sort of $50,000 of value if we sold it, and 50,000, that in terms of what the physical need level was, we wanted to show you two scenarios. One in which physical need was really depressed, so that you could see the difference between, we didn't want that to distort the decision. So in this case, where physical need isn't that great, you can still see that this is a really successful strategy, even done for a very small amount of the portfolio. It's almost self-sustaining at 3% of the portfolio if physical need's not high.
In your example of 140,000, are you better off spending the money and then selling it and getting a premium, or would that not work out?
So, yeah, great question. And there's two answers to that. So one is, if we did the work and then turned around and sold it, we would get paid for that work, for sure. No question. And
you'd make more than the 50 you're talking about.
Potentially, yes, right, given the market, right? So there's one model where a totally reasonable model would be for us to do the work and then go and try and sell it for whatever we could get, and then take the money, and obviously all the money goes toward mission. The challenge with that is, as we've seen, our capacity to do renovation on these units is pretty tight. And so the benefit of selling them as is and letting the private market sort of get that, they get that trade-off, is that we take a lot of pressure off our, that would allow us to then renovate more of the units we intend to keep, and stay within this capacity. If we were in the old climate where it was not too hard to be able to put these through our own renovation machine, then I would say, yeah, absolutely keep that value in-house.
But the private sector has the same issue.
But there's just more of them.
Yeah.
There's more people willing to buy 1 or 10, renovate them for their purposes. And as you'll see later, it's not just a for-profit mentality either. There's a nonprofit interest here too, but because there's more of them than there is of us, even if you sell it to an individual that just wants one, that still takes pressure off us. And there's lots of individuals like that. So it's balancing, do we want to keep that value for ourselves, which is a totally reasonable thing to want to do, with but balancing with this idea that capacity is really a challenge for us around this portfolio, so much so that it's taken us 6 years to get back to our plan.
Question I have. I understand the selling them as is takes the pressure off of us for the redevelopment or the rehab, but it also gets rid of a unit, which we can't replace. Because I'm going to say we can't replace on a unit per unit basis because we're not getting enough value for the shell to go out and get a new unit. So it really does get to a question, and I'm not sure we've done it, to determine what is the value of the stock that we have. I mean, we have gone along for years saying that if we sell something, we want to replace the unit. What you're saying here is, and I think it's a valid point, what we have, the stock that we have in terms of a lot of these just ain't worth nothing. So yeah, we can sell it, but we're not going to get a heck of a lot in the way of a return. It'll take the pressure off of renovation, but it also will lose us a significant number of units that we are making available to folks who need affordable housing.
Well, and the mismatch is these units are basically worth zero to us as rentals. But to the for-profit, not even the for-profit, just for the for sale private market, even to nonprofits to an extent, we think we could sell these units even with the total physical need still there. We think we could sell, and we've done this to an extent. We have some data on this. So like, for instance, back in, I think 2010, 2011, the commission sold 53 or 54 of these scattered site units. So this is, obviously a long time ago, it's different. Different market, but those units basically sold for 190,000 each as is.
I missed that. That was on my, when I was away from the commission for a while.
Yeah.
But I guess one of the questions I have is, to what extent could we, or should we explore, maybe renovating and selling to nonprofits with some use restrictions?
Right.
That's in the presentation.
yeah.
I think that's next slide
Okay.
or.
Yeah,
Sorry.
we can, if you want, we can go to the
Okay.
slide. Because that is one of the core decisions, or not decisions you're gonna make today, but one of the core areas of guidance is all right, so if yes, on disposition under some circumstances, then we want to get into what circumstances. This one circumstance, so we've been spending a lot of time with Habitat for Humanity, so we'll bring you the easiest of the, if you're going to dispose of, this is the feel goodest. So like, we've been spending a lot of time with Habitat to create, and they've actually gone to their board in terms of these business ideas to make sure that everybody's good on it. So under the Habitat scenario, they can commit to paying at least $65,000 per unit and accepting up to $150,000 per unit in renovation. So basically, and then they would commit to those units being rented at 30 to 80% AMI. It'll be a mix. And obviously it would go into their program where, there's the sweat equity model, the individual comes in or the family comes in and they do some of the renovation, they get the house and it all folds into their program. So on one side of the spectrum, so that would do two things for HOC. Sold. So that would go into their. Yeah, Habitat will actually have we're working on two channels with them that are not exclusive. So one, we would sell it to them into their home ownership model. So that would be for sale. And then there's another program that we're designing with them. And to be very clear, we're also talking to other nonprofits to do the same thing. There's enough to go around, for sure. That HOC would maintain ownership of the unit. It would stay a rental, but Habitat, we didn't even know this came up as we started talking about the ownership idea, that they also have a program that is miraculously designed to where they actually don't want it. It's not for home ownership. It's for them to simply, they have a conduit of grant funding.
That's new.
Yeah. So these are the things we'll start bringing to you once we're sure. We just wanted to get like a sense of like, definitely don't bring something like that or do. So on the disposition side, on one end of the spectrum, at least 65 per door, which is certainly under market for what those units would get if we just sold them. But that's okay, because connected to that is clear mission, as well as their acceptance of up to 150,000 per unit. So it would basically be worth $215 per sale to HOC, because we would no longer have that. Now on the other, go all the way to the other end, there's an argument to sell some of these units as we did with the 53, 54 back in 2011, where we're just going to sell them for whatever we can get. We're going to sell them as is. And our guess is we can get $200 to $250 per unit is our guess. And that's important because, to your point, which we definitely, as John mentioned coming in, our assumption is if we're selling a unit, you also want us to be identifying the unit we're going to buy or replace. That the idea is to at least hold our count where it is. And we know that.
And what would that cost?
Yeah, so the MPDU's pricing these days is around $235 a unit for new.
Oh.
So if we can sell a unit for $200 to $250, which seems reasonable given that in 2011 we were getting 190. Plus we're offloading, the physical need liability that we would have. Then so we've got a good replacement plan. So the downside of the sell it for as much as you can get is that that unit's now gone to the market and is not necessarily going to be affordable. But we're going to get enough money to buy another MPDU. On the Habitat side of the spectrum, we're obviously getting great mission outcome from that unit still serving great mission even once it's left us. But we're going to have a delta that again will be incumbent upon us to figure out how to meet that delta of 65 and 235 to be able to buy that place.
And putting aside the stress on your finding a contractor is you did the 100,000 or whatever of work, you'd sell it for a bunch more presumably in this market.
It's a two-piece puzzle. I know it's a far more complex issue than that, but there's two pieces to this puzzle. There's the value proposition and time, right? You can do anything you want if you have money and time. Well, we have a compressed amount of money and we have a compressed amount of time that we want to address this portfolio. So then it's a matter of how do we put those other underlying pieces together to maximize value and do it in the shortest amount of time and present our best public purpose going along the way, which is the one-to-one replacement. So Zach has presented that we've narrowed that gap to a manageable amount where we don't have to rely on leverage to advance this cause. And that's the reason that this works.
And I'm not disagreeing with maximizing capital and putting it into other purposes to achieve our goals. Certainly. I'm not against selling it as is. I'm just exploring. But, I were to buy one of your units, I've got a contractor. I know you're thinking, and I'm not talking about me personally, and when you sell these things, someone's got a contractor. Sometimes it'll be a mom and pop thing, but there are contractors out there. I know for 1,100 units, it's a silly discussion, but if you're selling 8 or 10 at a time, I would think you could find a contractor, but you'd know more than I would. It'd be nice to generate profit and have your own pot.
In here
Sure,
too,
go ahead.
because we obviously are also doing severe and extensive capital repairs on the remainder of the portfolio at the same time that we're talking about this small group in terms of potential disposition. And so there will be, and the board and commission will hear recommendations related to additional costs related to those capital needs for the other portion of the portfolio. It's just balancing, how do we keep those renovations ongoing? How do we fund those renovations and think about a way to dispose of some of these assets so that it can fund those renovations? But there's a whole lot of work that will be underway and many contractors that will be deployed across the portfolio to maintain the capital needs across the portfolio. So I guess I just want to indicate that it's not a situation where we think we can't find contractors for 11, because we're still meeting the need for all of these other assets that we have here. It's just a strategy in terms of how to quickly get some equity and some resources to fund those additional renovations.
The one thing that I don't think it's been mentioned too much, you talk about looking at the portfolio in terms of age and trying to essentially either get rid of or modernize the really older ones. But we also need to look at the dispersal and the change in terms of need and thinking in terms of the location for affordable housing. The decisions the commission made in 1980 or 1990 are different today. I mean, TOD is a whole different thing. We've also, just to take one example, we have a lot, as you've indicated, of units in Montgomery Village for a lot of reasons. Whether all of those were right or not in terms of the decisions that were made, we are concentrating. We had a lot of concentration. And I think the 55, most of those were from Montgomery Village. But we've also acquired some properties up in that area. So there's no need for the continuation of that many of those affordable units in that area, but there are needs in other areas. So we have to look in terms of what are the priorities because of dispersal, what are the priorities because of age, what are the priorities because of condition, all of that stuff. But that's why you're here. Thank you so much, John.
Did you have anything from staff? Then next you'll hear from Ali Ozara with respect to property management.
Good morning, Commissioners. I'm Ali Ozair, VP of Property Management. If we could go to slide 17, please. Next, please. It's page 39, slide 17. Thank you. we recognize there are opportunities to improve the occupancy at our scatter sites. However, occupancy for the last year has been pretty stable. Most of the weakness is due to two properties that are currently below 70% occupied, and we also have two properties that are currently below 80% occupied, but most of the portfolio has been fairly stable over the past year in terms of occupancy. Staff is confident that organization changes and process improvements that we're implementing currently being undertaken will resolve the legacy vacancy issue. Staff will continue to provide updates on the performance of the portfolio moving forward. Next slide, please. The property management organizational structure. In the past, the scatter site portfolio was managed through 5 different scatter sites, each being managed by a property manager. And they had two other layers of support below them. The team was overseen by a regional manager who would provide supervision and support to those 5 individual property managers. For the residents to be able to reach their property managers, they contacted the team associated with the property. All functions included certifications, leasing, touring, rent processing, were all centralized or self-contained within each individual team. Numerous practical issues with teams often operating within silos included issues around customer service. With the new structure that we're implementing, many of those issues will be resolved as we're dividing teams functionally and simplifying employee responsibilities. The regional manager and property managers are now more narrowly focused on resident, current and prospective residents' experiences. Several additional support roles will focus on emphasizing the accuracy of data. The housing specialist team all of the housing specialists will move under a single leasing and occupancy manager, with priority being placed on timely processing of all leases and recertification. Next slide, please. Unified point of contact. Previously, prospective residents had to wait to be connected to the correct team based on the ownership entity of the property. Current residents also had to call the phone lines associated with the ownership entity of each of the properties that they were residing in. Now residents have a unified point of contact with a dedicated team fielding all current and prospective resident inquiries. We're also looking into ways to modernize the way prospective residents can be connected with opportunities within the scatter site portfolio. The new structure with a dedicated leasing team will also be helpful in streamlining our prospective residents' experience. The unique nature of the scatter site portfolio also warrants evaluating whether HOC should create an independent brand for our scattered sites. As we know, every multifamily property has its own name, it has its own brand, they have their own marketing strategies. Staff is recommending that we develop a recognizable marketing brand for the scattered site portfolio that will complement the improvements in the resident experience and evokes the property characteristics not found in the multifamily units that we often hear about from our residents who do reside within the scattered site portfolio. Thank you.
In conclusion, I'd like to share with you that we know and believe the scatter site portfolio has significant value and public purpose. We think it would benefit from branding and from a life cycle analysis with respect to capital needs, from leasing to CapEx planning, performance monitoring, and improving on the average aggregate age of the portfolio would all benefit this portfolio for long-standing sustainability. Thank you for your attention.
Are there additional questions?
I really applaud your strategic thinking on a difficult portfolio. I was really impressed, notwithstanding our little discussion about doing the rehab yourself or not, which I think you should consider as an option, but
Consider it.
I know it's I think really interesting. I'm curious, Zach, and I've never done this, but like in Montgomery Village, where Rick was saying there's a concentration of scattered site, whatever the number is, that you don't think you could syndicate where there's a big concentration versus all over the county. You still don't think you could syndicate that?
We have tried extensively, and it's not even just a credit issue. I mean, we even have issues on the FHA side, on the mortgage side too, where it's just and with Fannie and Freddie, and so there's a real reservation. The only moderately positive change we've seen is in is prior to the current environment was really on the private banking side because, when all the big private firms jumped in to the single family rental market, the banks to some extent work with them, but no, it's been we've tried for years to try to get the agencies, HUD, credit investors to come around to even clustered, because we do have pretty, they're not but a few blocks away to get to 50 on some of these, but it just it just really doesn't get there for them anymore. Whereas, in the 80s and 90s, you fire them right in there to the tax credit program. Many of these are former tax credit properties.
But there's also the question whether we really would want to syndicate them.
True. It would be time consuming at a very.
No, I mean,
difficult
it's not even that. I mean, because of the concentration. And the fact that there have been neighborhood reactions to HOC and ownership in the community. So, I mean, that's an issue that we have to deal with. I want to echo your comments in terms, I think it's a great piece of work and appreciate the work you've done and briefing us. Be interested in what the plan is in terms of continuing to brief the commission. But the one area that you didn't mention, or at least I didn't pick up on it, is what role is there for your division in the acquisition of new properties or the development? I mean, I know we have an acquisition development over here, but without receiving the benefit of your experience and knowing what we're faced in these other things that we're already participating in, you're not having the most informed decisions necessarily made on the acquisition and development side.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely right. I mean, we really just walked right up and said the word acquisition. Obviously, there's the most obvious version, which is to resume buying our portion of MPDUs, but that's not what you're talking about. We're talking about more than that. So we do have some thoughts. The packet was getting long. So we do have some thoughts that we would bring based on you all saying, yeah, we would entertain this idea of acquisition. We think there are some good ideas. One that's been on the shelf for a while. A few years ago, we had some conversations about actually creating an acquisition fund with the council with the county to actually buy scattered sites in and around CBDs in central business districts. Because it would have, obviously we buy them and we can rent them in the meantime, but they would have the added bonus of when it comes master plan time, it would allow for really allow for planning to go further. Just as an example, if you look at the Bethesda downtown plan, they nerfed every property around inside the boundary of the CBD because there were single family homes on the outside, on the other side of the line, the CBD. And so if we were actually over every 20, 30-year cycle of master plans acquiring single family homes in and around the central business districts of the county, it would have that knock-on benefit of in 20, 30 years, maybe what you're doing is aggregating these into a multifamily, which you obviously can't do for many of the ones we own now because they're out in single family neighborhoods, and that's not what's going to happen. So that's one idea. And then another idea is that perhaps there's a connection with missing middle housing, right? So like as more and more flexibility is given to where, your only option isn't just a single family home more and more. And so it could even be that some of these single family homes eventually turn into a new duplex or a new quad or a triple or whatever. So we think there's also a way to plug in something like Sandy Spring, the Sandy Spring missing middle deal. Right now there's one home. We bought 617 only Sandy Spring Road. It's the only home on that property right now. And it's going to turn into 19 units. And so we do think there's also some more creative ways to where it's not just, sell one here, buy one here.
And let me just jump in, and also, I think one of the points you were raising, Commissioner Nelson, is really what's the role of asset management when we're exploring acquisition opportunities? And let me assure you that asset management, maintenance, as well as property management and our real estate team are working really closely together on each and every real estate proposal, ROFRs, anything that we're thinking about. The entire team has been working in tandem. And so I also want to take an opportunity to applaud the team because they've done a remarkable job here in terms of thinking about our scattered sites portfolio. In terms of next steps, the question really is, how do we proceed? We wanted an opportunity first to brief and get some thoughts, questions from DevFin. Obviously, as you can see, we've started to explore the potential of partnership with entities such as Habitat for Humanity. We're thinking about how we can structure a way to move forward with ongoing capital improvements for this portfolio. And so having an opportunity to have this initial discussion with the committee was important, and ultimately looking for and we'll think through what is the next action that we bring to this board to ultimately start taking the steps that we need to materialize this plan. And I think the decisions around how to approach any potential disposition obviously allows us an opportunity to think about, is this particular set of properties best suited for what type of disposition? What wasn't said that I also want to just highlight in our analysis is anything that we would even consider disposing in addition to the geographical considerations, because it's not just where we're concentrated, but also there are places where building new large new developments might not be as easy. For example, Gaithersburg. So would we want to remove our presence there in any significant way? So there's a lot of consideration in addition to ensuring that we do not lose properties that might have been retrofitted for reasonable accommodation needs, thinking about there's, a great deal of consideration and policy decisions around what properties would be potentially best suited for a disposition versus need for capital improvement. And when we get to that point, we will be sure to share some of the thoughts around that, and also look for the board's guidance. As we go through strategic planning, we look forward to hearing that guidance there as well.
And I hope what came through our presentation is preservation is key. Capital expenditures are key for the long-term sustainability of the portfolio. So we have these items at the edges, but the core portfolio is one that we want to keep, retain, promote, and have as a public purpose entity for. We don't want to kick this can to the next generation. We want to address it now.
Good. No, thank you. And, I'll also express my appreciation to the staff for putting this plan together. It's, we've needed to address this portfolio for a while now, so it's good that we're doing so. As you've heard, I think there's obviously, priorities on, making sure we're providing quality housing, but also, maintaining affordability, the total level of in the portfolio, with any potential disposition, ideally, if we are disposing, preferably, maintaining some kind of affordability on those properties is great. I also recognize that, while we're working to, reduce vacancies, in some cases for some of the properties that may be difficult without additional renovations. So there is also an opportunity cost for just holding on to a property, and we are limited in terms of our capacity, in terms of how many units we can renovate each year. So I appreciate, the strategy. One just additional thought, where in cases where we are disposing, like a great working with Habitat and other nonprofits on the other side where we're maybe not maintaining affordability, able to there. I'll just throw out that, there are a number of CDFIs actually that have programs for small minority developers. I don't know whether Enterprise has one. Capital Impact, which is in Virginia, I do know has one. There may be some opportunities to partner with them as well. And so, it might be a little mission adjacent opportunities there. So just encourage exploring that as an opportunity if it comes to that. I think
One suggestion I have, I'm assuming we're not doing this at the full commission. I would suggest that you consider clipping this portion of the tape and sending it to the other commissioners. Because I think it would be very informative for the rest of the commission to view it without having to go through the whole meeting, but just clip this piece and send it to them.
Great recommendation. Will do.
Thank you.
Yeah. If there are no other questions, then I will turn to our final agenda item. And it's getting late, but this is on, we just talked about some potential disposition for scattered site. This is a discussion about potential multifamily disposition. I will just sort of tee this up a little bit, saying that I had asked for this item to be added to the agenda because there had been some questions raised by some members on the commission about potential disposition and whether it's something worth exploring. And I think it's a timely question in terms of our work with developing a new strategic plan. I think it is. But what I guess one of the things I wanted to say, this is a purely for discussion purposes. Also, we are not making any decisions or taking any action today, but it is an opportunity to address some questions that have been raised about disposition and understand some of the considerations that may go into potential disposition of multifamily properties that HOC owns. I think, the commission as a whole is not opposed to disposition. They're in specific instances, whether it's scattered site or even with multifamily, there have been times where we think it is appropriate. But I think things obviously to keep in mind in any discussion is, our mission of, maximizing affordable housing in Montgomery County. And, to the extent that disposition may help us further that, I think it's worth asking that question and having that consideration. But I'll also note that it's not the only part of our mission. There is the support that we provide to our residents. And so, I think that is also part of the discussion. So again, not something that we are going to make any decisions about today. But I think, this is an opportunity again to ask questions, to talk about pros and cons of potential disposition, when we might consider it, what would be involved in the consideration, and and get a sense sort of the committee's stance on potential disposition. So with that, I will turn it over to President Andrews to sort of kick off any additional discussion. Wanted to hear perspective of the staff and then also give the commission an opportunity to ask questions.
Yes, thank you. I know that this has been raised in a couple of committee meetings, and my hope was really to have an opportunity to hear from the committee in terms of your own discussion and or thoughts related to the potential of pursuing this route. But I will just, of course, remind the committee that the general philosophy of HOC has been one in which we activate communities. We bring our our presence to communities and ultimately allow for additional affordability, inclusivity, et cetera. And we have benefited from a buy and hold model. We've benefited more than any other housing authority, quite frankly, which is why we've been so successful and why the HPF has turned into a model, really going back into many years in which that philosophy has played out and has been beneficial for us. With each of our assets, the fact that we have the ability to pull out our equity and reinvest allows us an opportunity to use our capital and those assets in many different ways. Some instances, our decision is to take the capital and infuse it back into that particular property for renovations. In other instances, we do just that, but we're also able to leverage that equity and build more. A key example of that is Alexander House, where we took the equity and was able to invest it in the building of our new Leggett. And so there are instances in where not only the actual asset itself, in that particular circumstance, it's Elizabeth House and the Leggett, but there are other circumstances like the Lindley where we're able to leverage our property and build. And there's many examples of how we have approached leveraging our assets, but ultimately maintaining our footprint, maintaining our commitment to the community. I will say that one of the key considerations when we think about any potential disposition of our larger assets is how it will impact our cash flow and our cash streams. Obviously, our development fees, our resyndication fees, our rental incomes are what we use to continue our operations. And so reducing our assets and our portfolio in any major way will have other consequences. And I guess the other point I would just raise, and Chair Markowitz, you mentioned it, but one of the key considerations when we are somewhere is that we are assured of long-term affordability without question. We are assured that our residents will be taken care of in terms of resident services. And quite frankly, we garner the trust of our community. One of the trends across the nation, unfortunately, is that there is a negative perception of housing authorities selling parcels to private developers and ultimately privatizing affordable housing. And it has created a negative connotation for some of our peers, even locally. And so we don't have that reputational challenge because we have been steadfast in our mission, steadfast in ensuring long-term affordability. And I, of course, look forward to hearing the discussion amongst the committee, but I will share also that even in the work that we've done with the Housing Production Fund, one of the key questions that the council has, well, one of the key considerations that the council has required is that we maintain our ownership interest in those developments. But quite frankly, even when we're having these discussions with peers who are also seeking to emulate that model, they're asking how were we able to maintain that that ownership structure and how do we approach it? And with pride, we are echoing the fact that it has been our position, our model, our philosophy to ensure that we maintain ownership of our parcels and of our properties and developments. And so, of course, the commission is fully aware of that background. So I'll just, wanted to just echo it so that you all could have it as a kickoff point for your discussion, but definitely look forward to hearing from the commission in terms of your thoughts related to how we should consider or potentially reconsider how we've approached our portfolio.
So we all have the same concern about the strategic plan. There's not enough resources, right? To implement some of the goals in the strategic plan, if not most of the goals. And how do we do that? We could find it from the feds, maybe not. We could find it from the state, maybe not. We could find it from the county, that's possible. But where are we going to find the resources to increase affordability, to deal with the affordability crisis, to build more projects, to do maybe innovative things? with internal vouchers, where do we find all those resources? I don't have the answer at all. No one in this room disagrees with the notion of continued affordability. It should go without saying. It's worth saying, but it's really should go without saying. Long-term affordability, getting rid of assets and getting rid of affordability is not a non-starter with everybody in the room. So that, and disposition isn't contradictory to that. You can dispose of something with all sorts of restrictions. I'm not pro disposition. Just like in the discussion we just had, I'm pro options. And an option is, in any given job, is to re-syndicate it, generate obviously resources to improve the asset. Otherwise, you wouldn't waste your time. And maybe generate additional resources because you are selling the property to the tax credit partnership. And if you're selling it essentially to yourself, you have some flexibility in picking the sales price. I get that. And I've done that. And sometimes it makes sense to sell because there are parties out there who might want to pay a premium. You can put all sorts of restrictions on how they operate the asset going forward, or even maintain some ownership interest, generate additional resources that could be put to use in very innovative ways. We heard casually, you and I, Chelsea, that maybe our portfolio is worth 500 million to $1 billion of embedded equity, not on day one. To me, that's a resource worth talking about and considering. That's my only perspective, is options, just like we discussed about whether you put $100,000 or $140,000 into a townhouse and sell it that way, or you just sell it as is. I'm not for either option. I'm for what works best in the context of everything else going on. As Chelsea, you mentioned, it's a big portfolio. And I don't see the difference between that discussion and our larger assets. To me, it's a very similar discussion. What is the best option, keeping in mind the goals we all share? And look, we've got even other people weighing in. It's just great. And so my view is very simple. It's what's the best option? And we should consider it. I'm all for resyndication. If you can generate resources, again, it goes without saying, you'll generate resources to do the rehab, to improve the asset. Otherwise, you wouldn't be wasting your time. How do we generate additional resources to implement the strategic plan? It's not going to come from the feds or the state, and probably not from the county. It's going to have to come from innovative thinking. And this is just an option. If indeed the equity embedded in our portfolio is the numbers casually mentioned, it's hard to pass that up as at least something worthy of consideration, always with the predicate that if you disposed of an asset, it has to maintain long-term affordability, appropriate ownership, appropriate management. We are not we have no monopoly on solid management and development resources. There are parties all over the country who can do this. And would we generate more resources to achieve the strategic plan? If we refuse to consider disposition when appropriate, we just refuse. The question you really have to answer is, how are we going to implement their strategic plan? Where does the money come from? I don't have an answer. It's right. It's a joke. Where's that coming from? The feds? It's not coming from the state. Maybe some could come from the county. I don't know. Where is it going to come from? And it's really an important discussion, because otherwise the strategic plan isn't worth as much as we would want it to be. We want to achieve those goals. How do we do it? And so if we refuse to consider the option of selling our bigger assets at the appropriate time, the question has to be asked and answered is, how are we going to implement our strategic plan? Because the needs here are tremendous in our county, right? No one disagrees. And that's the question, is if we refuse to change our perspective in considering all the options, how are we going to implement the strategic plan?
I think part of the question that you're also raising, Robin, is, I mean, and you said it, about considering it when it's appropriate.
Yeah.
Right. And I think, I'm curious, because I think, again, it is not something that HOC has not considered at times when I guess it has felt appropriate, but I'd be interested in, hearing from staff as well as from you, when is it appropriate to consider disposition, or what, because there have been times, I guess, where it has been brought to the commission. What are the conditions that when, is it something that is always there for staff, like when thinking about options, and there's just something that kind of quickly rules it out? Or, I mean, is it more just that we aren't considering it because we don't think about it as part of our mission? Or what is it that leads us to, or leads staff to at times make a recommendation to consider disposition?
Well, I guess a couple of questions. Number one, I'm not sure that it's a factual statement to say that we don't consider disposition.
Right.
Because we do. I mean, we have in a couple of instances. Also, I guess a question I have, you mentioned 500 million to $1 billion in equity. Whatever that number is that equity available today, or is it restricted because, in fact, we've got a lockout in terms of financing? If you got a lockout on X million dollars in a property, then it's not available for us to, in fact, utilize today. I think that in the experience that I've had, when we've come up to a situation of refinancing a property, we do try to discuss the different options. I mean, there's no question, but that we plan to sell a property. Well, we got involved in some litigation, but that was planned. We were going to sell it. We also talked about selling another property in Rockville. We also have used some of the proceeds to increase the affordability in particular developments. So I think that we are, in fact, all on the same page in terms of maximizing the resources that we have. But I would also suggest, at least from my perspective, a couple of things that I've always been concerned about is, number one, I want to make sure that we do continue to provide as many affordable units. And yeah, we can sell units and put controls on them. But when you put controls on the units, you have devalued the property, so it's not worth what it was on the general market. So is that a win-win? And I'm not sure about that, but it's clearly something you have to consider. Joint ownership, I'm not a big fan of that unless we happen to be the controlling owner. I mean, because we are in fact labeled by what the property does and the performance of that property and the way it looks and the way people are treated. And if we are a minority partner, I'm very, very concerned in terms of what say we have over the overall management of that particular property. And I think that's something we've got to consider if we were to talk about the joint ownership. I guess the only question I have in terms of some of the discussion that we've had around this table is trying to look at the whole portfolio at one time to see where we can pick. I mean, I think we do that, don't we? When your financing is up, we look to see how to refinance it so we can, one, get some more money out, get better rates. I mean, that's the other thing that is done frequently. I mean, I've been sitting at this table many times when staff has brought deals to us that in fact permit us to refinance at a cheaper rate, which provides us with options to in fact provide additional affordability. So I think that maybe all that we're doing isn't fully appreciated in terms of some of the things that you're thinking about. I think we have done a great deal of those.
So this all came up, I think, in the context of Metro Point, just because it was written, we're going to resyndicate. And my only question was, did we consider other options? And that spawned a discussion Chelsea, you and I have had with, and John participated in. And the issue you raised, Rick, is very important.
Yeah.
Management is everything. It's
Absolutely.
not very exciting. It's more fun to do big financings and stuff, right? It's really fun sometimes, if you don't have a 90-day clock. But management is what makes things work. Because we know you're going to do the right kind of rehab or build something properly. But just they're in dealing with what you said, Chelsea, about the long-term philosophy of the agency. The needs of the county have changed, and we should explore all the options. It's my only point. And affordability and management, if we were to discuss something, is absolutely essential.
You mentioned Metro Point. I guess it just raises another issue for me. And again, this is something very personal. Every time I talk to somebody about HOC, I raise Metro Point because people have the idea that the housing authority owns stuff out in the bad part of town. But I will frequently talk about the fact that we have a development sitting on top of Bethesda Metro stop with rents going from one level to the other. I said, well, Metro Point too.
Yeah.
But both of them. And I mean, so even if there were some maybe bigger advantage, you would be giving up something if you were to consider selling the Metropolitan. And I think that from HLC's perspective and branding, that is a very, I'm sorry about my voice, that's a very significant issue for us to face. And we got to think about that wherever we are, in whatever neighborhood we are.
And Metro Point is two properties, right? It's a credit one and a market rate. They're two separate, and you own 100% of both. And resyndicating it and making it work financially, it hasn't. It's a perfectly good goal. We all share it. And you got a market rate one that you own 100% of. You know, what would that sell for? Is it worth considering? I don't know the answer, but is it worth thinking about? I can't think why we wouldn't consider it. That's my only point. Why would we foreclose the discussion?
But it's not two separate properties. I mean,
Isn't it?
paper, it's two properties.
Right.
It's one building.
Okay.
But people who live there think that they live in Metro Point.
Yep.
And if I've got Joe Kennedy owning the market rate stuff, and HOC owns the affordable stuff.
So these questions are all,
Building.
and you know more about it than I do because I'm new. All we're doing is really validating the point. It's worthy of discussion. That's all I'm saying. I don't want to have a discussion that is limiting when there are a lot of resources that we need to raise to achieve our goals. Notwithstanding the past, the county is different. Wheaton is different, right? When you conceived of, not you, the HOC conceived of, what was it, 17 years ago, 18 years ago, 20 years ago? It's a very different part of the world. Can we do something different with the resource? And maybe the plan you laid out is the right one. I've resyndicated things, I've sold things, you know, and different goals, but we shouldn't foreclose the discussion is my only point.
But I don't mean to be over argumentative, but I think one of the things, and you're right, you were just learning some of the stuff that HOC does. I think staff has in fact considered a good bit of what you're thinking about. But because they have the history and they know it, they've dismissed some of those options, which I think speaks to why it is important for the commission to be aware of the fact that that the staff is considering refinancing a property. If an individual commissioner has a question about that or wants to know more in the way of background and what some of the pluses and minuses are, then we ought to follow that up. And I don't think the time to do it is at the time that we're presented with the final package when you got to approve it the next day.
Boy, I agree with that. I completely.
But I mean, I really do think that when you bring stuff up, we're reaching the point that we've got to refinance the Metropolitan. And if you don't have the experience, and granted, I've been around a bit, so I do understand some of that background, then you have to discuss it, because we can't just and don't discuss all of those things in the committee meeting. So it is an opportunity we ought to take to individually raise some of the questions, and we can bring some of the issues to the committee. But I think that would help us too in responding to those.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good point. And, I would agree, Rick, also that, I think, and staff can speak for themselves, but I think that disposition is a consideration, or is, it's like in the toolbox, at least, and I think it is totally appropriate to consider on a case-by-case basis to say, the disposition in this case might be a good option. And, maybe it's a false assumption, but I guess I'm assuming that, when staff is bringing us a recommendation, they have gone through, the different options. That said, I think to Rick's point, and I think, I heard you agreeing as well, like to the extent that, staff can sort of forecast for us some of the upcoming decisions, things that are we're going to be asked to make considerations on or approvals on, rather than at the time we're being asked. I think that is helpful, and it gives us a sense of what's coming up. It does give us an opportunity to ask questions about, which way you're leaning, or how are you thinking about this, whether something might be the case, and then it can avoid sort of last minute issues.
So I agree with that, and knowing it early, and I guess the Open Meetings Act stuff kind of hinders us in giving briefings and all the rest. But Chelsea, to your point about deal flow, if you sell something and it generates a ton of resources, you'd put it to use somewhere else while still preserving affordability. And maybe you did this on MetroPoint, and I'm just learning. So MetroPoint may not be the right example, but maybe you considered disposition there and it was cast aside. I'm guessing not, but I don't know. But anyway, I can't think why we would foreclose an option just for a philosophical reason, or historical reason.
I just want to chime in a couple of things. One, yes, of course, if we are, and as you see, we have pretty robust activity with the committee and with the board. We, of course, to the extent that we can, give preview and or presentations. We've given presentations in the past to the committee that aren't time sensitive and brought them back, and scattered sites was one of them, right? And so we definitely want to make sure that we're, as you can see, how we just approached scattered sites discussion, having those discussions with the committee in advance, making sure it's not a situation where you must make a decision, so that if we need to come back to the committee with more consideration, we can. And so that is definitely, philosophy that we agree with, and I will ensure that we do. In terms of MetroPoint, because that's been used as an example, it obviously is an asset that is one in which has operated at a deficit for quite some time. The thought that it would even be a viable cash cow at this particular moment is kind of not something that I on initial glance would think. But even if it were, I will say that the philosophy around wanting to ensure that we have and maintain our assets, especially those that are so close to Metro and afford for that transportation option, it truly would have required a great deal of offer for us to think that it's something that the board would have an appetite for in terms of disinvesting. And so I do think that holistically as a commission, if there's a change in our thought around what assets are really our heart and true assets that we really do want to make sure that we hold and preserve, and our philosophy that we've approached in the past in terms of how to leverage the equity that we can out of these assets and reinvest without losing that footprint, is something that I think would be beneficial discussion. That philosophy decision, we can come case by case every single time there's a potential option, and we do, especially as it pertains to acquisition as well. But the full analysis on if this is a situation where we should divest and how much time and attention is put into that particular thought process is driven by the fact that we have viewed our assets as truly beneficial to the long-term plan and viability of HOC and our mission. So I think we're all saying the same thing. In terms of how we approach our strategic plan and how do we get there, you know, there also is the reality of the thought that we would address 37,000 people in any 5-year time frame by building 37,000 new units, or it's really, it is a difficult proposition. It's an impossible proposition. And so what we have to do, quite frankly, is what we have been doing, which is garnering additional resources from our partners, leveraging the resources and the flexibility that we currently have in our arsenal, and thinking creatively. We've talked a lot about, and our team is exploring subsidy concepts that could help address individuals on the waiting list, and also making sure from our perspective that we maintain and expand on our affordable housing footprint. And that's really how we can approach it at this particular time. And so I do think the larger discussion, I do want to bounce it back to the board, for lack of better terms, because if there is a shift in our philosophy around how we would approach our major assets and our buy and hold philosophy, that is something that would require a little reorientation from staff. And I don't want to suggest that we do not do due diligence, because we definitely do. And within the course of this last year the board has been presented with multiple disposition requests.
Yeah, and I think, you know, an important point that has been raised, Chelsea, you raised it, Rick has raised it, I think, Robin, you've acknowledged it, you know, that it's with our assets, and, you know, what we do with them is not just about maximizing, you know, profit or, you know, getting the most capital out of it. So, you know, I am hearing, and I agree with, that there are a lot of considerations. You know, we obviously, we mentioned long-term affordability, we mentioned the services. It has been brought up, sort of the, you know, the brand value of certain properties, you know, as well as sort of the location, you know, and making sure that HOC residents have different options, whether it is around transportation and it is location in terms of, you know, places of opportunity. You know, so, you know, maybe we could get a lot of money for one property and build more in another part of the county, but it's, you know, we see the value of, you know, having a property and options in, you know, those places of opportunity. So I'm not sure that, you know, and again, like I don't think there's like a huge amount of difference from what I'm hearing.
Like there may be, you know, we're an unusual county, and HOC is very unusual, right? We all have experience with other housing authorities around the country, and, you know, it's not always constructive, particularly in urban areas, but even in rural areas. Well, one thing we lack here in our county is the footprint that you talk about, Chelsea, affordability is really HOC overwhelmingly, right? There aren't a lot of other players, and it's a weakness in our county, not HOC being the weakness, that there's no other players doing significant affordable deals. And the county needs to expand that footprint to other players, because we'll never, as you say, deal with 37,000 ever. And we should be thinking larger than our footprint is the footprint that has to be maintained. There's a way to diversify the footprint of affordability. And to me, that's a huge goal, because we'll never address the goals of increased affordability if we limit the affordability discussion to ourselves. I know we can only control ourselves, but the goal shouldn't be our footprint. Our goal should be in maintaining affordability while expanding other options. And it may be re-syndications. It might be the best option, but it may not be.
But I think, and again, I've got different perspectives. What you describe is the role and function of the county executive in DHCA. Our role and function is to provide as many affordable units, service the residents of those units as we can. DHCA is in the position to, in fact, encourage and develop more affordable partners to come in to the community. I mean, there's also a downside in terms of too many affordable developers, as we've seen in some neighboring jurisdictions. But in fact, this administration has brought in enterprises, hasn't done anything in the county really prior to recently. And then earlier we brought in a nonprofit from across the river. So there has been an effort to bring in some entities that have some ability to produce. And we've got 2 or 3 that have it. But I think that it is really the role of the HCA to try to develop and nurture that and get them to play a larger role. And I mean, but again, even the county is doing that with some of the dispositions and some of the assistance that they're providing with the HIF. They're increasing the portfolio of some of the nonprofits. So some of that is going on, but that's their role. That's not our role.
The jurisdictions that succeed, they work together.
I'm not saying we're not working together.
I know you're not, but part of our role is to expand. Our role is to expand affordability. There are a lot of ways to do it. And anyway, without repeating ourselves, affordability in selling an asset is a given. We're all for that. I just don't want to foreclose discussion of what the best approach is in any given deal. Deal flow to me isn't important. There'll be plenty of opportunities. It's what's best for HOC and the population we serve. And that may be re-syndications or it may be selling, but we shouldn't limit ourselves. So, but I would say I appreciate hearing everyone's views, or, you know, I didn't hear so much from Zach, but I appreciate hearing your perspective, Chelsea. And we may disagree, but that's okay. If we always agreed, things wouldn't be going the right way, I think. So diversity of views, just like a diversity of options in looking at any given asset is worthwhile.
Sure. No, yeah, I think it's a good discussion. And like I said at the beginning, I think it's worth having. You know, I think, you know, while there may be some disagreement, I don't think there is disagreement over the idea that, you know, disposition on a case-by-case basis, you know, when appropriate, is worth considering. Now, maybe the difference is about when it's appropriate.
And we'll just deal with that case by case.
Yeah. So, but I also think that, you know, the recommendation, the suggestion that has come up of like a little more advance notice in terms of upcoming decisions, which then give commissioners an opportunity to, you know, ask any questions in advance of something coming to us formally. And I don't know that, Chelsea, that needs to be in the form of a formal briefing or presentation at the, you know, but even if it's kind of a list that we get regularly of here are the items that will be, you know, coming up and to, you know, to watch out for. I think that then gives commissioners an opportunity to say, oh, I'm curious about that, and then just ask the question. So.
I appreciate hearing your views, though. I really did.
If there are no other issues, and I appreciate, you know, the discussion that you're bringing and the, you know, the perspective that you're bringing. So it is good to have, you know, new blood on the commission and to bring fresh perspectives and, to ask questions that, maybe weren't being asked and, it may not lead to a change, but I think those questions are always worth asking. So, if there are no other issues to be brought before the committee today,
There must be something we can talk about for another hour.
yeah. I will offer a motion to adjourn the meeting. Second, the motion carries and the meeting is adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.